again, there could be many indicators, but we in this paper we are going to focus on undernourishment, the proportion of population that is undernourished. Undernourished. Yeah. So that is from FAO. FAO has a bunch of variables on food security, so we took some of those variables. But in this, I'm talking about the general aspects. So this Addis Ababa agenda for, I forgot the full form, but it has to do with Addis Ababa agenda for advancement or something. So it's based on so it's probably the first meeting that happened in the 2012 or 13, very recently, and there they had a discussion on how can trade facilitate the sustainable development goals through inclusive growth, poverty reduction, and all these different aspects. So usually there is not there is insufficient clarity on whether trade can promote them or affect them. But what they came up with was an agenda to make sure that trade can actually promote these the sustainable development aspects. So that is one thing. And then when you look at the 17 sustainable development goals, 12 of them are directly related to trade. And if you look at these targets, 116 targets, around 35 of them are related to trade. So in other words, basically trade is an important driver or tool through which whatever we define here as sustainable development can be promoted. And the reason to take Asia Pacific as a region was mainly because the project was funded by the UN for that region, but even in general terms, it's an important region because it constitutes 32% of global trade and 55% of the global population, and it includes 1.2 billion poor people. So it's a very important region that way. So that's the context, and then further getting into the specifics of the study, we are looking at particularly at the trade agreements that have been discussed in the past few years, and there have been a lot of setbacks in the recent past couple of years, but they are still relevant, like Trans-Pacific Partnership, and of course US is not anymore part of it, but still it is going on in the Asian Pacific. They have a CPTPP, which is Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has been already signed and ratified by all the countries except US. And this one, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, is kind of shelved now, but it was being discussed between US and the EU. So right now it is kind of stalled, but it might have some future in the coming years. And RCEP is Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and this is probably the only trade agreement in which India and China are both participants, and there are many other Asian countries involved in it, and there is also Australia and New Zealand involved in it. So it's one of the, we can say it's one of the major trade agreement within the Asian Pacific, and it includes all the many of the big economies. So these are the agreements that we are going to focus in the study, and then how can these agreements affect sustainability as we define in these three broad aspects. Like you mentioned, in general the SDGs are a wide range of things, but we only focus on three aspects. One is CO2 emissions, second is food security, as in prevalence of undernourishment, and the third is wage income inequality across skill categories. So there are different workers with different skill levels, and their incomes vary, and what happens to the inequality of these wages. So these are the three aspects that we focus on. So these are some channels before I start actively presenting our methodology and results. I wanted to give the conceptual clarity or conceptual big picture on how things may play out. So if you have more open trade, imports are going to be cheaper, and that is going to have an effect on food prices. So and food supply, because you are going to import. So we may producing wheat in a given country may be very expensive. So if you open up the import of wheat, then the wheat prices in the country are going to be cheaper, lower, and that's going to be that's going to mean that food is more easily available, so poor people can afford it.
Yeah. If you're in Thailand, you export rice, and your price of rice goes up.
That's also there. Yeah, that is also that's also an open another thing that can happen. Yeah, the rice is a good example. And in 2008, this was a big issue. 2008 and 9, for example, India was exporting a lot of rice, particularly non-basmati rice. And I was at that time new. I just was a new immigrant to US in 2007-8, and I was directly affected by the food crisis, because India decided to ban the exports of the non-basmati rice, because exactly like what you said, the locals they need decent prices for a local population, and that affected the prices here. So that's another example. And the third example is food policies, like domestic support, subsidies to farmers, then income security for farmers. They also can affect the food security thing. So there are multiple policies here which affect, and we are mostly going to focus on trade and its influence on food prices and food security. And we are going to consider both the positive and negative aspects, because positive aspects being the cheaper imports, negative aspects being the expansion of exports. So those two. And then the second aspect is greater trade might also mean that greater production of both the pollution intensive and renewable industries. Both can expand. You never know which will expand more. It's going to depend on various factors. So depending on these, whatever is going to expand, the emissions can increase or decrease. And in most cases, we can say that emissions might increase, because the renewables are still a very small part of the economy, and whatever boost we are going to give, it's not certain that they will expand enough to reduce the emissions. Then the third aspect is the income inequality, wage income inequality. So when a trade increases, the production in different industries are going to increase or decrease. So if, for example, the skilled labor intensive industries like services sectors and some of the high-tech manufacturing sectors, they increase, then maybe the skilled wages will increase more than the unskilled wages, and that can lead to expansion of income inequality. If on the other hand, if the exports of textile products or agricultural products expand, then maybe unskilled labor intensive industries will expand. So that means that the unskilled income would increase, which means that inequality can go down. Inequality between unskilled and skilled can go down. So these are some broad channels where trade can affect food security, emissions, and inequality. So I'll start talking about the data sources. There is a data set called GDyne, which is based on GTAP, and I have a few slides. I'll talk about this data and the model. So it's a computable general equilibrium model and data, and I will give some introduction to what are those models and data sets. So that I'll come later. Then we use FAO data, Food and Agriculture Organization, and this is something that we developed in another project with FAO, where they had all this data for the past 25 years, 1990 to 2015, for 217 countries in the world, on calories supplied in terms of kilocalories per capita per day for the countries, dietary energy supply adequacy in terms of percentage. So what is the available dietary energy supply as a proportion of what is required on a daily basis, and this is quite volatile. So we took a 3-year average instead of taking it as a just taking the annual data. We still got an annual data, but it was based on 3-year average. Similarly, protein supply, which is gram per capita per day, which is also a 3-year average, and food production, which is in dollars per capita. So this is constant prices, and then undernourishment, which is prevalence of undernourishment as a undernourished people as a percentage of population. So that's the thing, and this is a 3 years. So these are the variables we got data on, and then we decided to come up with functional forms, and we did some econometrics, which will come later. And this is what we are doing here. So basically, we wanted to estimate relationships between all these different variables, and we did panel regressions, and we chose fixed effects based on the Houseman test, and we did them. So we did multiple trials and errors, and finally we found that these were the functional forms that worked out well. So diet, and we did log linearization, so that it's not just simply linear, but we capture the non-linear relationship. So the dietary adequacy, which I talked about earlier, is a function of food production, protein per capita, and calories per capita, whereas calories is a function of diet, food, and protein, and undernourishment is a function of all the four other variables.
For undernourishment, you also need inequality.
We focus. So in the model later on, when we combine this with the general equilibrium model, there we will have each of these variables will be impacted by inequality and also production and so on. But here in this system, we just focus on the food variables. So we did not include the other macro variables here, because we wanted to find the interrelationships between these variables.
The question would be, holding constant averages, if you had more inequality of income, that will generate more undernourishment. If you're holding the means constant.
Okay.
So if I define something over the whole of India, I'll get more inequality of income. I'll get more undernourishment given the average than I would if I look at a rich province, at one province which has less, because there's some of the inequalities between provinces. So the inequality in each province would be lower than the inequality in all of India, so it'd be my composition.
Okay.
So, you know what I'm saying is,
sure.
but in general, the undernourishment is going to be produced by how income is distributed, at least in places where people are buying their food.
Well, thanks. I think I should consider that. So we should have inequality as another variable here. Maybe can have a Gini's index, because that we have the data for the analysis.
But see whether the Gini index works.
Yeah.
I mean, for the richer parts, it may not work very well, but in
the poor,
it should work It should work in a place like India.
Yeah. Sure.
So this is you have a time series.
Yeah, we have a time series. Yeah, like 1990 to 2015. Yeah. So yeah, we will. I'll incorporate that. Thanks for the suggestion. So this is how we did the econometric part, and the econometric part was mainly for the food security part of it, the undernourishment part of it. So now I'll move on to CGE modeling, the part where I mentioned about GTAP, and I'll come to that. So basically, it's a computable general equilibrium. That's the expansion of word CG, and this is, as many of us know, general equilibrium theory is the underlying principle of these models. So we have, so basically we just make it computable. So we have the Edgeworth box and the bunch of equations we have we learn in applied microeconomics, and then we combine that with input-output data, where, for example, you have a production function, and output depends on intermediate inputs and primary factors, and the intermediate inputs are going to come from an input-output table. So you have an input-output table where to produce steel you need a wide range of inputs, and you also need labor and capital, and the labor can be skilled or unskilled. So that is how we develop this computable general equilibrium, and it's also called applied general equilibrium. It is a comparative static model typically, so that's why when you ask about time, we say there is sufficient time to reach an equilibrium. So it is not a disequilibrium model, so it always has to be in equilibrium. So there has to be, the inbuilt assumption is that there is enough time to achieve equilibrium. But of course, the model that we use for this purpose was a dynamic CGE model, which captures investment accumulating into capital and then being used for production. So these models are generally based on neoclassical economics of production, consumption. So there we have theories of production. So like I mentioned to you, production function is an example. Then we have consumption. We have a demand system, which basically expresses per capita consumption as a function of income and prices, both own prices and cross prices. And we have trade. We have a detailed treatment of trade. For example, we have this Armington assumption, which differentiates. So imported wheat is different from domestic wheat because the variety is different and maybe quality is different. So even if the imported wheat becomes 20-30% cheaper than what it is today, we may still continue buying domestic wheat in addition to imported wheat because they are not perfectly substitutable. There is an imperfect substitution between imported and domestic. And similarly, imports from different countries are treated as different varieties, so there is imperfect substitution between them as well. So that is how the international trade part is there. And we can also have alternative theories, not only neoclassical. We can also have Keynesian and other theories, and that is based on what you call as a closure of the model. So the model assumes certain variables to be exogenous and certain variables to be endogenous, and we can modify that to move to different types of assumptions. And I'll talk about those aspects. So getting a little deeper, these are the different components of a CGE model. So we have agents, and agents are usually producers, consumers, and government. And factor endowments are all the factors we have: land, unskilled, skilled labor, capital, natural resources, and others. And commodities are basically goods and services. And markets are available for both commodities and factors. So we have supply and demand for each commodity and for each factor. And the equilibrium conditions, supply equals demand. If it holds for n-1 markets, let's say there are n markets in the economy, then there is this Walras law which says that if you have no excess demand in the economy and if n-1 markets clear, then nth market will clear, which is kind of logical also. And the nice thing about CGE models is welfare analysis, and basically these are based on the equivalent variation concept we have in microeconomics, and using that we can look at the consumer surplus, producer surplus, and understand what happens to welfare, not only to the standard variables like GDP, exports, imports, and so on. So why would we go for CGE model in this kind of an exercise as opposed to maybe econometrics or partial equilibrium? So resources are finite. So in a partial equilibrium model, it's very difficult to capture an economy-wide constraint that the government revenue is only so much. So government cannot keep subsidizing a particular sector, and it cannot be open-ended. In a general equilibrium, it's all closed. So if you subsidize a particular sector, then maybe the government expenditure on other sectors will have to go down. So that resources being finite is captured well, and this is the same point here. And another thing is the factor income is generally taken as exogenous in a partial equilibrium model, whereas in a general equilibrium model it can be endogenous. So if income increases, it can be partly from the expansion of factor returns because there is greater demand for labor, so wages increase, and partly it can be because of various other factors. So factor income being endogenous is another. And there are many other features in partial equilibrium models, like for example, aggregate output is taken as exogenous in many PE models, partial equilibrium models, whereas in CGE, both the prices and the quantities and the aggregate variables are endogenous in a CGE model. So here is some comparison across models, and this is kind of a digression, so I don't want to get deep into it, but if anyone is interested, I can share this slide with you.
I guess you're selling the extra fuss of using the general equilibrium model would be interesting to show that you get different conclusions if you do a partial equilibrium analysis of some sector as opposed to the general equilibrium analysis of something happens.
Yeah, I wrote a paper on that comparing for auto industry. I did partial equilibrium model for that and did a general equilibrium model and compared the two, and actually came up with a blended model where you have the partial equilibrium model for detailed sectors and use a general equilibrium model for the aggregated sectors, and both are combined, nested within each other. So that is one, but that's not in this study. But
were there some things that turned out differently?
Yeah, it was very different. For example, in the partial equilibrium model, the prices had to adjust a lot because the aggregate output was fixed there. Because aggregate output is fixed, so prices had to take a lot of the slack compared to quantities. So the predictions are very, very different. In signs, in terms of direction, they were very similar. Partial equilibrium and general equilibrium gave similar signs, but in terms of magnitude, partial equilibrium was way different from general equilibrium. And I would, from the numbers that I got, I felt that it is very difficult to believe the huge changes that we got from a partial equilibrium model as opposed to a general equilibrium model. And this is because of the factors that you mentioned before. But I'm happy to, I'll be happy to send the paper. Yeah. So yeah, we have done but these comparisons don't capture those technical aspects. These are more about what does a model have to offer in general. So we compare CGE models, partial equilibrium models, and gravity econometric models, and other macroeconometric models. But the points that we discussed are not discussed here. But I'll be happy to share the paper. Now coming to this, GTAP model is a very specific example of a CGE model. So CGE model is very general, and GTAP model, the expansion of the term GTAP is Global Trade Analysis Project. So it was started at Purdue University, and I was part of it before coming to UW. And so this is a global CGE model, which means that it has multiple regions and multiple industries. So it has 57 different industries, and we have input-output tables for those industries for every country in the world. We have 140 countries now, which is like 120 individual countries and 20 aggregated countries, which capture the smaller countries that are aggregated into different regional groupings. So this is basically a multi-region, multi-sector model, and you have the linkages between different sectors and also different regions captured here. So trade and input-output. So you can think of it in very simple terms. It's a database that that has input-output tables of different countries linked using trade data. So it has a regional household that receives all the income in the economy and then distributes to the private household, government household, and savings using Cobb-Douglas utility function, which means that usually the initial share of government, private, and savings would stay fairly stable and constant. There will be some fluctuation, but it will fairly be stable. And the savings are then pooled across the world, and there is a mechanism called Global Bank, which collects all the savings from the world and then distributes to different countries as investment. And how is it distributed depends on the performance of different economies, different countries. If they become more competitive, their rates of return increase, then there will be more investment flowing into that country. So that is a mechanism for investment allocation. It's a perfect capital market. So there is, it's not completely, there is perfect capital mobility. There is capital mobility, but it won't be, I wouldn't say perfect, because if, for example, one country becomes most competitive, not all the investment will go to that country. There will still be investment moving to other countries. So,
but that simply means that the margin,
yeah,
the equality doesn't mean the averages are equal.
Yeah, that's true. So the initial allocation of investment across countries may be different from the final allocation of investment across countries, depending on which country is performing better and which is not. But it won't be dramatically different in the sense that like it was 10% each country before, and now it is like 90% one country and 10% all other countries. So it won't be dramatically changing. Even if a country is becoming super competitive, not all the investment will flow into that. So that is the investment part. And then the firms, the companies, they can have intermediate demand and the factor demand. They can demand intermediate inputs and factors, and that is basically a Leontief. So there is no substitution between intermediates and factors. And there is product demand from government and private households. So they demand for products from the industries. And there is investment from savings, as I mentioned here. And there is a zero profit assumption. So it's a perfect competition model, and you have constant returns to scale. So these are the standard assumptions there, and we can modify these assumptions in different frameworks. And trade, I mentioned about Armington assumption, which is imperfect substitution of imports in domestic. And there is a CES, constant elasticity of substitution function there. And we have international transportation services, where to transport goods from one country to another, the shipping services are provided by different countries, and there is some accounting happening for that. And there is equilibrium, there are a set of equilibrium conditions, supply equals demand in different markets. And I mentioned about investment dynamics, which is investment results in capital accumulation, and capital accumulation results in expansion of productive capacity, which means that whatever investment happens today is going to expand production tomorrow. So that factual thing is captured here. But again, there is a diminishing marginal returns. So if you have too much capital, too much investment in your country, then there is going to be a tapering of investments coming in. So this is the kind of a simple representation of this, and it's very similar to what we do in macro. So consumers spend on products, and they supply factors, and they get paid for that, and they have savings, and then there is government expenditure, that the taxes that the consumers pay to the governments, and the government buys something from firms, and they also probably provide some subsidies to both consumers and firms, and the savings converted into investment comes back to firms, and the factor payments are going from firms to the consumers, the laborers and so on. And similarly, the consumers buy products from the firms, and the firms buy products within themselves, because a steel industry buys iron ore from a mining company, for example. So these are all happening here. and there could also be something from the rest of the world, some imports from the rest of the world and exports going into the rest of the world. So all these things are captured in this framework. And this is a very simplified representation of the model.
I don't see in your figure, I don't see anything about innovations.
Yeah, so innovation is exogenous in the model. So innovation is, we can capture innovation in the model, but it is exogenous. So we have, for example, in the production function, there is this the A factor, which is basically whatever you can do. If you can produce more with the same labor and capital, the model doesn't endogenously capture it, but we can introduce a shock for that.
Just the coefficient,
Not the mechanism, not the inversion mechanism.
in any case.
That's something out
In the
there.
United States there is a huge fraction of production of information.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have information?
We have no, we don't have information asymmetry. So basically, we assume there is no information asymmetry. Yeah. So those rigidities are not captured here, information related things. And yeah, the only way to capture innovation here is the coefficient, the productivity technology coefficient. We don't have innovation inbuilt in the model, but there are some variations of the model where, for example, I talked about zero profit and constant returns to scale. Instead of this, we can have increasing returns to scale and imperfect competition, and there productivity becomes endogenous, and some part of it is going to be based on innovation.
Two more questions. One is, how good do you think your data are? You have numbers that you plug into your model.
Yeah.
But how accurate are they?
Yeah, so the data, we spend a lot of time, the group in Purdue where I was working, GTAP, Global Data Analysis Project. So we have a dedicated team working on the data. And the way we collect data is we use official statistics on input-output tables from different countries. And then we do a lot of cross-checking and reconciliation of statistics from the input-output tables and the international data sets. For example, we look at the FAO agricultural statistics, or United Nations trade data, and World Bank macro data, IMF macro data, and International Energy Agency energy data. So we look at various data sources and we reconcile. For each, for example, if you're talking about energy, then we want to be consistent with the International Energy Agency data. And if you're talking about macro, then we should be consistent with World Bank and IMF. And if you are talking about trade, then we have to be consistent with the United Nations trade data. So for every aspect of the data, we go with the most reliable part of the official data sets, and then we combine all these things together, the input-output tables and all this trade data, trade and protection, also policies, tariffs and other things. So it's a huge process. It takes a lot of time to develop each version of the data, and it's not done by one team, but it's an open source project, so a lot of researchers across the world. So the team in Purdue cannot claim to be an expert in India or China. So we have researchers from every country contributing to it separately. So we get the local expertise also.
Plug all these numbers into the model and you get results.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an idea how good the results are?
Yeah, so we cannot take the results on face value. So we have to do a lot of analysis. So we have a lot of equations in the model, and each equation has some economic theory behind it. So when we run all these numbers, when we get the results, we won't directly copy and paste the results, but we'll do a lot of analysis. We'll come up with qualitative insights. We'll come up with the economic theory based insights on why something is increasing or decreasing. So I wouldn't talk so much about accuracy. It's not we cannot claim that we can predict the future accurately, but at least we can say that it is very theoretically consistent and empirically sound way of doing things. So we won't say that something increases somewhere or decreases somewhere, but we'll explain why something is increasing, what are the drivers, what are the reasons behind it, and so on. So and it all comes from the theory within the model, not from some observations. So yeah.
The thing is, you're not testing some proposition. There's no way in which this model that you've set, the way that you've done it, could show that some idea was wrong.
No, you can. It is more to. So for example, in the initial slide I mentioned that trade can lead to increase in emissions or decrease in emissions, right? So that is a open-ended question, and here, because of the combination of the data and the model theory that we have, we can say whether emissions will increase or decrease with some reasons. Because, for example, I can say emissions would increase because these industries, coal, maybe oil, these industries expand, whereas renewables do not expand so much, for example. And we can go deep into that further. Why did they increase and why did they not increase, and so on. So in that sense, it can actually deal with some of the hypothesis testing kind of questions, but not in a very technical way, like what we typically we have a null hypothesis, an alternate hypothesis, and we have t statistic. So we cannot do those kind of things, but we can say from these results these are like simulations. These are basically simulations, and from the simulation results we can say how things will evolve in the future. What will be the combination of the real data and economic theories? So that's a broad thing. But we have something called systematic sensitivity analysis here, which is kind of like a Monte Carlo kind of system where these simulations can be run multiple times automatically, and we can get a mean and standard deviation, and then we can impose Chebyshev's inequality to get a lower bound and upper bound instead of showing point estimates. So these are some ways to handle uncertainty. So I think I will skip some of this. This is a way to estimate non-tariff barriers, but I think I'm running short of time. I'll probably go to the results. So this is the standard model, and we already discussed about various aspects, and we used some extensions of the model. For example, there is one extension which has renewable industries. In the standard model, we don't have renewables. So we have different types of electricity, solar, wind, and so on. And when we do something like Paris Accord kind of simulation, which we did here, we can see what happens to if you give an emission target from outside, how will the mix of industries change? So it's in a way it's an optimization kind of problem. And we also have a poverty-related model which can capture the headcount ratio of poverty and how is it related to trade and other variables. And this is the model that I discussed earlier, the integration of food sectors, the regressions that I discussed before between the different food security variables. And there is we also incorporated the Gini coefficients. We have the Gini coefficients before we run all these simulations, and then we compare that with what we get later. And we also have investment liberalization, so we can actually reduce the barriers to investment, barriers to FDI, and so on. So we have all these things, and so this I already mentioned this, and so what we do finally to just sum up, we have the standard GTAP model where I showed you the figure, and in that we added a Gini coefficient, and we added the food security variables and the equations that we discussed before, and then we also have the emissions. So those three things we had, and then I'll first talk about these three scenarios, different scenarios of trade liberalization. So the first one is RCEP, which is Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is basically pretty much removal of tariffs and reduction of non-tariff barriers in all sectors within the members of this partnership, which is most of the Asia Pacific countries. So India, China, Japan, Korea, and Australia, New Zealand, and so on. That is one. Second one is what is called a Regional Economic Cooperation Initiative, and this is something that is initiated by UNESCAP, United Nations, of all its members, which is actually almost the entire world, because apart from Asia Pacific, the US, Canada, and European Union, they are also members of this, and some African countries. So it's almost like a global free trade agreement. Globally, every country reduces tariffs and reduces non-tariff barriers. And the third one is TPP without US. So Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has 11 countries, and US is out of it. And that again is like complete removal of tariffs and 20% reduction in non-tariff barriers. And I also talk about few more scenarios, and if I have time, I'll show a visualization we developed at UN. So these are the coefficients we got from our econometric analysis. So all these are positively related. These are all positive food security variables. Like so dietary adequacy is positively related to protein and calories. It's more if calories increase, the adequacy increases much more than just proteins, because calories is more wholesome. And similarly, if you go the other way around, calories are very positively affected by dietary adequacy, and food production has a small positive effect, and protein also has a positive effect. But this is the most important equation. If you see, undernourishment will go down a lot if calories go up, and it will go down even more if the dietary adequacy increases, and if protein increases, it goes down a little bit. The interesting thing is the undernourishment is not directly related to food production or but it is related through calories, diet, and protein. So that's one finding.
There isn't a lot of hunger in Singapore, even though they don't produce much food.
Yeah. So that is an example for this. Yeah, true. You can just do with the imports. You can have the imports, and that is one inference we get, and for that reason in the model we get mostly undernourishment goes down if trade increases in many cases. So I'll start showing some results. I have only 5 minutes, so I'll show the results, and so these are some results. So emissions. So of course there are a lot of things here, but I'll just draw your attention to one thing, which is positive or negative. So emissions mostly increase. Emissions are bound to increase if trade expands. So these are all of them are trade. So tariff reduction or non-tariff barrier reduction for different agreements. Those are the different colors. So in most cases, we see that the RESI, which is pretty much the entire world, that is a purple color here. The non-tariff barrier reduction in almost the entire world is the most prominent, and that is going to increase emissions. So all these are going to increase emissions. There are small decrease in emissions possible in some countries, like maybe India is one example, maybe because they import more and produce less, so the emissions in that country goes down.
If they import natural gas and don't use as much coal, or who knows?
Yeah. And that those explanations we have given in the report, but those are there. So basically there is some narrative here. So this I already discussed about this. So if cleaner sectors expand, then emissions fall, and otherwise emissions rise. Most countries, these are the examples: India, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Iran, Netherlands, China, and these regions. These regions may cut their emissions because of some of the examples that we can think of. Maybe they expand their renewables increase, or they import more less polluting goods and so on. So, but the common observation is that you can think of it as a global trade agreement. The global trade agreement has the biggest effect, whereas for certain countries, these are more important. The local agreements, RCEP or TPP, they're more important. And in all over the world, non-tariff barriers are more significant than tariffs because they are much more. There is a lot of scope for reducing non-tariff barriers. Tariffs are relatively small compared to non-tariff barriers. So if you look at undernourishment, it's again a very interesting or very intuitive result. So undernourishment decreases across the world, and some of these maybe some of the big increases are good, like Vietnam, Thailand, and so on. But you can see Singapore here. Singapore doesn't have much. It's pretty much zero undernourishment, and the reduction you see is like almost like an artifact. So it's like a huge reduction of a zero base kind of thing. But there are some countries where undernourishment can actually increase, and that when I looked at them, like you say, for example, Sri Lanka in some cases can increase, Kyrgyzstan can increase, and so on. So when I looked at them, the reason I found was mainly because of the excessive exports of food production, like you mentioned, and so the domestic food production goes out, so there is going to be lower food availability for the local population. So yeah, so this is the explanation that I just gave. In terms of inequality, there are mixed results. So for undernourishment and emissions, the results are pretty similar across the board, but inequality is kind of mixed. So in some countries it decreases, some countries it increases. So, but one pattern I could see was mainly in the developed countries, the inequality can increase, while in the developing countries it can decrease. The reason is that in the developed countries, the expansion because of trade happens in the skill-intensive industries, and that aggravates the inequality because the demand for skilled labor increases more than demand for unskilled labor, and hence inequality increases. Whereas for the developing countries, the expansion happens mainly in the unskilled labor intensive industries, and that means that their wages go up relative to the skilled wages, so the inequality decreases. That's a broad conclusion we got, and there are a lot of country-specific examples here. So these are some preliminary conclusions we got from the study. First, saying that the global trade agreement is going to be more positive than others, but still the regional agreements are important for some countries. And in general, non-tariff barriers are more important than tariffs. And actually, to reduce undernourishment, promoting trade is an important aspect, but again, there are some exceptions. The cleaner, countries which can promote trade in cleaner sectors can reduce emissions, and if not, they can actually increase emissions. And the income inequality is the story that I mentioned before. In terms of policy, one thing when it comes to inequality is that somehow the governments should either promote the unskilled labor is benefited by this, and then the skill and then in most cases skilled labor is going to get benefited, so they have to come up with some programs to promote skills and so on. But it's not exactly obvious how they do it, but this is a broad conclusion. And another broad conclusion would be so trade can be used as a tool to reduce inequality, undernourishment, emissions in certain instances, which you have documented in this. So again, the caveat is that whatever we are talking about here need not be like universal truths. These are not like, we are not trying to validate any hypothesis here, because these are very specific to the kind of experiments we have discussed here and specific to the countries and sectors we are talking about. So there are some other scenarios we did, and it is published as a chapter in the Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report. It's called APTAR in 2017, and So one thing we examined was new protectionism, trade wars and increase in tariffs, what will happen to that. And then also we did the same things we did here. We also did emission constraints from Paris Accord. We did that, and we also did the income transfers to the unskilled labor to compensate losses, and we also did aid from rich countries to poor countries when the poor countries lose. And this basically this is the end of the presentation, but I have a link I can show which actually documents the